Many years ago, long before I was a priest, I remember this really awkward experience of going to confession. Anybody else out there who finds going to confession a little bit awkward? Well, I myself, just figured what could be weird about you going to this dark room, sharing your deepest, darkest secrets with this priest you've never met before, or it's actually worse if you have met him before. So there I am. I'm in my early 20s, and I decide I'm going to ride my bike to this faraway church where nobody knows me, right? And so I get to this big cavernous church, and it turns out there's a huge lineup of sinners. So I have to get in line, and as I'm waiting, I'm going through the list in my head because I think, you know what? I want this to be surgical. I want to go in, confess my sins, and make a clean getaway, right? And so there I am, and it turns out there's actually a few people in line that I do recognize, but I'm trying not to make eye contact, doing that little dance. Well, finally, it's my turn to go in. And so I get in there, and I kneel down, and I start confessing my sins. And about 45 seconds into it, I hear the window slide by me, and the priest's like, I'm with somebody on the other side right now. Could you just wait? It's not yet your turn. So I'm totally thrown off. I'm more embarrassed. I was already sweating because I had biked over there. Now I'm sweating profusely, and the walls of that little confessional are starting to close in on me. Well, it feels like a short eternity passes. And finally, the window slides open again. It's like, all right, now you can go, kid. And so I start confessing my sins. And I don't know about you. I probably shouldn't tell you this, but I have like a little bit of a strategy. I usually throw a few softballs across the plate, start to get out some easy sins, build some momentum to work up to the big fish, right? And so I'm confessing my sins, and I get them all out of there. I'm feeling pretty good, and I waited for a response. Silence. And I waited. And I'm thinking, okay, this must be like one of those really holy priests. He's praying right now. Silence. And I waited. And then there was this heavy breathing that I could hear, and which turned to soft snoring. And I'm like, oh, what do I do? It's like, Father, excuse me, Father. And I hear this stirring and kind of a cough clearing his throat. And then super loudly, he's like, well, are you married? And I'm like, no. And I'm thinking to myself, what does that have to do with anything I just said? And then he says, well, was she married? And I'm like, now I'm really thrown off. Like, she who? I have no idea. And I'm thinking, everybody in line is hearing this whole interrogation, right? And then, well, how many times did it happen? And I just wanted to get out of there. So I'm like stammering some kind of response out, and finally he's like, okay, pray 3 Hail Marys. He gives me absolution, and I am gone. And I go from that dark confessional out into the bright lights of the church, and I'm totally disoriented for a second, and I realize I need to do the walk of shame past that whole lineup of sinners who just heard the whole thing go down. And so I get out to my bike, and I ride as fast as I can out of there, and I vow never to commit another sin again, which lasts for about 5 minutes until somebody cuts me off in traffic. But truly, I can laugh about the experience now, but at the time, I felt so exposed. And isn't it true? We don't like to feel exposed and embarrassed. And actually today, I hope that you cannot relate to the story that I just told about confession. Maybe you can. Maybe you've had a really bad experience in confession, but even if you haven't, I think you know that feeling of being exposed and embarrassed, and how we hate that. We want to do anything to get away from that. And it starts right from childhood. Picture a child who's done something, they knocked over something and it broke. And their parent asks them about it, and right away, they start to tear up and tremble, and they want to run away and hide. Or teenagers. Now, teenagers are famous for avoidance tactics, right? It's like parents are asking them, Well, where were you? Nowhere. Well, what were you doing? Nothing. Well, who are you with? Nobody. And it's like, did you just spend the whole weekend hanging out in a black hole of nothingness? And so they're playing it cool, right? Until, by accident, one of their siblings spills the beans, or their friend's mom calls and is like, hey, do you have any idea what your son and my son got up to this weekend? And then the gig's up, right? They're busted. And what do they do? Their only recourse is to run up to their room and lock themselves in, right? Because they've been exposed. Or even as adults, this feeling of being exposed, we hate it. I mean, one example is public speaking, right? What I'm doing right now, I feel a little bit exposed. Or you're in a meeting and your boss asks for a progress report, and it's like you realize, I never followed through, or you didn't even know how to get started. You were too afraid. And you just want to crawl under the boardroom table and hide and hope that it'll all pass away. And you're thinking, this is human nature, that here we are. Every time we feel exposed, we want to run, we want to hide, we want to cover things up. Well, we have this story today of a guy named Nicodemus who comes to Jesus under the cover of darkness. He kind of wants to have this conversation with Jesus, but he also kind of wants to keep it hidden. Right? Here's this guy. He was a member of the Sanhedrin, so he's a Pharisee, but part of this ruling council. He's kind of a religious celebrity. And he doesn't want to be seen by Jesus, seen by others talking to this backwater rabbi about spiritual things. And so there he goes under the cover of darkness. And in John chapter 3, there's this rich conversation that transpires between the two of them, including the famous John 3:16 we heard, "For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son." Well, I want to focus in actually on the very end where there's this contrast. Jesus is talking about light and darkness. So in verse 19, he says this, "And this is the judgment, that the light has come into the world, and people love darkness rather than light, because their deeds were evil." So Jesus is saying the light has come into the world. Who is the light? Jesus. He's saying, I myself, I am the light. I've come into the world, and there's a judgment. Now, the word that's used there is krisis. In Greek, it could be translated judgment or verdict, or sometimes it refers to this decision moment, this choosing between two options. Just think of a courtroom, for example. There's a verdict, either guilty or not guilty, right? Well, Jesus is saying there's a judgment. Now, he continues, "For all who do evil hate the light, and do not come to the light, so that their deeds may not be exposed." And there it is again. Human nature, right? We hate to be exposed. Right from the beginning. Think of Adam and Eve. They commit sin. What do? They run away. They run away and hide themselves, and then they sow fig leaves because they're experiencing their nakedness. They're feeling exposed. They want to cover themselves. Think of a couple of other illustrations of this. So there's this story I heard of some saint, I can't remember who, a nun who described the situation. So imagine there's this dark room, and there's this light on one side of the room, and you're on the other side of the room in darkness. And from that place of darkness, you look down and you're like, oh yeah, I'm looking pretty good. There's my habit, it looks great and everything. And as you start to walk towards the lights, you start to notice there's these huge stains on your garment. And you're starting to feel exposed and self-conscious. And if you walk even closer to the light, there's even more stains that are appearing that you're seeing. And you have two options. You can run back into the corner, into the darkness, and hope that all of those stains will remain hidden, or you can walk towards the light and expose them so that it will be revealed what needs to be cleaned. Or another example, and this kind of comes from St. Augustine. He's talking about somebody who's sick or who has an injury. You have a choice. You can run to the doctor to seek treatment, but that will involve exposing yourself to him or her so that the doctor can offer the proper treatment and healing. Or you can run away from the doctor and hide yourself and possibly die from your illness. Now, Jesus, as he's presenting this judgment, this verdict, and he's making it clear, if you remain in darkness, you will remain in your guilt. He ends with some really good news in this last verse. But those who do what is true come to the light, so that it may be clearly seen that their deeds have been done in God. Those who step into the light are set free from guilt. And I guess the way that I would summarize this whole passage would be this. Again, we have two options. You can expose yourself to the lights or be exposed in darkness. You can expose yourself to the light freely, expose yourself to Jesus, or be exposed in darkness. I want you right now, type that into the comments, expose yourself to the light or be exposed in darkness. This is so essential that we get this. We're continuing this preaching series, as Father Alex said, it's called Worth It. It's all about the cost of discipleship, what it means to follow Jesus. To follow Jesus is awesome, it's great, but it comes at a cost. No matter the cost, it's always worth it. Well, today, I'm talking about this cost. Being a disciple means having the courage to expose yourself to Jesus. Because as followers of Jesus, we need to be people of integrity, that the inside matches the outside. I love this definition of integrity. Integrity is doing the right thing even when no one is watching. And sadly, we can think of so many counterexamples of this. People who, politicians, celebrities, professional athletes, even religious leaders, who they had this public image on the one hand, but on the other hand, they were living a double life. And they didn't take the opportunity to expose themselves, to seek help physically, emotionally, spiritually. And in time, their darkness was exposed, which often leads to scandal. Now, I don't rejoice in any of that. I think we should definitely pray for each of those people, but I think it makes the point clearly. You can either expose yourself to the lights or be exposed in darkness. What can we do? How can we respond to this message? Well, I think one of the best ways that we can expose ourselves to the light, to Jesus, is to go to him in the sacrament of reconciliation, which is also referred to as the sacrament of healing. It's this wonderful place we can go to Jesus, the divine physician, to seek healing. Now, again, I know it can be awkward, and I have had my own awkward experiences, as I started with, but I've had countless really positive and amazing experiences in the confessional, where I've received forgiveness, where I've received mercy and freedom. And so I can't recommend it enough. In fact, the church asks us in this season of Lent particularly to go to confession. We're asked to go to confession at least once every year, but particularly in Lent or Easter, to make a point of doing so. It's such a gift to be set free. Now I realize we're in a pandemic and everything's more challenging, so we have to do our best. But we're entering into a week that is focused on reconciliation. So it's an opportunity to step into the light. On Tuesday at 7 p.m., we're going to air online our Lenten reconciliation drama. So feel free to check that out. Wherever you're watching right now, that's where it'll be. On Wednesday, all day, we have confessions from 10 to 5. Thursday night, Friday night, 7 to 9. In the evenings, both night, we've added extra times for confessions. And over these next couple of Sundays, we're even extending our hours for confessions then. Father Alex and I both really believe that this is so important. It's so essential. And so we're going to do whatever we can to make this sacrament available to you. And I hope that you will take advantage of it. As many of you know, we work on our homilies as a team, right? I'm so blessed to have Father Alex and Deacon David and Isaac supporting me in these messages. And as we're preparing this one, Isaac was sharing a bit of his own story, his personal testimony, and a key turning moment in his life. And I asked his permission if I could share it with you today. So Isaac is a seminarian with the Companions of the Cross. That's the community that I belong to. But he wasn't always the super holy specimen that we have before us today. You know, back in the day, when he was a teenager, he was a real sinner. He really was. And he was living in sin. He was filled with shame for all of his sins. Now, in time, he started to believe this lie. And maybe you can relate, because it's a fairly common belief that if other people really know me, they wouldn't love me. If people knew the real me, they wouldn't love me. Again, maybe you can relate, and certainly that kind of thinking can infect your relationship with God. And Isaac started to wonder, if God really knew me, would he love me? Well, he's a good Catholic, and so he would go to confession and regularly confess and all that kind of thing. But he was thinking, what are the sins that the priest and God would want to hear? And he'd purposely hold back some of the sins that he was afraid to confess. He'd keep them dark in the corner of his soul. Well, over time, sins were piling up, and he felt this weight of sin, this burden, this shame. He was living in this constant state of anxiety. What if people find out the truth? And so he finally decided, I've got to come clean. And so he found this faraway church. I don't know if this sounds familiar. In the middle of nowhere, he went to this priest, and he decided, I'm going to go for it. He figured nobody would know him there, right? So he confessed his sins, and he was afraid, he was sweating, all that kind of thing, but he did it. And as he was not even finished his confession, he was overwhelmed, and he just started to weep. These amazing tears of relief at finally being unburdened from all that had been weighing him down. And that anxiety that he had been feeling, that went away, and it was replaced with an experience of God's unconditional love for him. Now, Isaac shares this story freely, and he gave me permission to share it today because he knows it's not just for him. Every single one of us can come to experience this incredible gift of God's mercy and freedom in the sacrament of reconciliation. And I just want to say, if there's anybody listening right now, you're afraid of confession, maybe you've had a bad experience, maybe it's been a lot of years, or maybe you have gone to confession, but you haven't really shared everything. You haven't really exposed it all and brought it into the light. I just want to say to you, you've got two options, right? You can expose yourself to the lights or be exposed in darkness. And I promise you, if you take that courageous step to expose yourself to Jesus, he will receive you with mercy, with healing, with forgiveness. And it might just be this key turning moment, as it was for Isaac, in your walk with Jesus.